I am AC Wise. I am moderating this panel, which is What Makes Your Skin Crawl? Horror Beyond Modern Horror Beyond Borders. Thank you everybody who is here watching us. And we're going to get started by having the panelists introduce themselves. So I will go with the order people are appearing on my screen to start. So Clara, I'll let you go first and introduce yourself.
Hello, lovelies. I'm Clara Madrigano. I'm a Brazilian author of horror, fantasy, sci-fi, but mostly horror.
And Nelly?
Hi, everyone. I'm a Mexican writer. I'm living right now in the US, and I also love horror, and I'm very happy to be here with this group of amazing women.
And Jevnia, sorry, I screwed that up.
Evgenia. Hi, I'm Evgenia Triantafylou. I'm a Greek author of horror.
Hi, panelists. Just to let you know that you are streaming to YouTube currently. Everyone is watching you from YouTube and they're in the Discord channel. So you're good to go. Except who's moderator, please, so I can make you host again.
I am. AC
Okay,
Wise.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm Evgenia Triantafylou. I am an author of horror, weird science fiction, fantasy, and I'm a Nebula finalist this year. And I have a story upcoming in the next issue of Uncanny.
And finally, Nivedita.
Hi all, I'm Nivedita. Many of you may know me as Nibs. I'm a Bengali writer from India. I'm living in the USA right now, but I did grow up in Calcutta in India. I write mostly, entirely short fiction, mostly dark fiction, dark fantasy, and horror. And I have a bunch of stuff out of places like Nightmare and Fireside and Podcastle.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to chat with you all about horror today. And my first question is, as readers, what draws you to a particular piece of horror fiction and what makes it stand out for you? Are there particular subgenres or tropes that you find yourself gravitating to in your reading, or is it just sort of a matter of the right story striking you at the right time in terms of what stands out to you in your mind? And I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. If not, I can call on folks and give everybody a chance to answer.
I'll jump in.
Oh, great.
So a trope that I'm a complete sucker for is anything that has to do with the monster being inside. Like, I am the monster, the monstrousness is in me. Rather than there's an external monster I must face my own monstrousness. I just love that, especially when it comes to embracing or reclaiming your own monstrousness and maybe using it and turning it against the external monsters.
I love that trope too.
I love stories that show the weird in the mundane. That you think you're writing something very, very normal, and then there's something weird and unsettling and uncanny. I love that, and I love all stories that are beautiful and they're like a push in the gut, and that break me completely.
And Virginia, what about you?
I don't feel like I have a very specific trope, but I do write a lot of women in my horror, but that is generally in my fiction. I do like folk horror a lot because it's not fairy tale horror, but because I grew up in Greece with a lot of folk stories, I do tend to prefer to write in this environment a lot with people that are more like people who live isolated or who live very close to nature, and then something weird.
And Clara, what about you?
I do enjoy horror in general, psychological horror, the thriller horror, but I do have very obvious preference for the supernatural horror, even if it's just dipping a toe in the supernatural. And also, like Medadita, I do enjoy monsters a lot. Either the monsters we find inside of ourselves or, you know, actual monsters. I do love monsters. Oh my god. I want to have a monster boyfriend. So there you go. I spoke too much. I spoke too much.
I was wondering when we would get to the monster fucking topic, but
Right.
Took us
There we go.
almost
Oh, I
5 minutes in the panel to get to that. Sweet. I don't know if that's a new record or not. So in terms of, since we're all authors as well as readers, is it sort of the same things that you're drawn to in your own writing as in your reading, or are there different things that you're sort of your go-to themes that you write? And I know you all touched on this a little bit already in your answers, but if you have anything you want to sort of expand on that. And hi, dog.
Oh my god. It's so cute.
yeah,
The,
I
mo-
do
the
love
monster.
monsters for sure. I do
Yeah.
love reading a lot of the same things I write myself. And something I love is just food and hunger, appetites, whose appetites are monstrous when being on the menu is terrifying, as opposed to being the person who gets to decide what the menu is. There's so much in the notion of food and hunger and appetites and bodies and being consumed that's rife and rich for horror.
We had that wonderful Nebula nominated story last year that was all about that, it's the Cannibal Women of, please remind me of the full title in case folks want to.
It was 10 excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Ratnavar Island.
Nice, thank you. It's like I knew I wasn't going to remember the full title, so apologies.
I barely do, so.
Anyone else want to jump in? And Clara?
If I
Clara,
may,
go on.
when I am writing, I tend to write a lot about families. You know, it's something that I wasn't aware, but now I am. I have to be. And the curses and hauntings that bind a family together or tear it apart. I think that every family carries a particular curse with itself, you know, and I'm very interested in how these connections can be, uh, depending on how little or big the crimes and sins were committed, how they echo through generations. And that's something you usually find in my stories. And while I do like to read about similar kinds of stories, as a reader, I always try to find quite the opposite of what I write, because as a reader, I want to have every kind of experience. So I am really in a phase of going after haunted houses kind of stories, or monsters kind of stories. I'm not to be talking a lot about monsters here. But that is basically what I like to write about.
And
I
Nelly,
like
what
to
about
write about Mexica/Aztec gods, because for Mexica people, the dualities were very important. So I want to show that in my writing, that something that is about creation and destruction at the same time can be terrific. And also, I'm not sure if you have seen the codex representations of those gods, but some of them are like really the soft nightmares. So I think it's like a great ground for horror. I very recently I've been into experimental forms, because I think that some stories can benefit from being told like in a different way, and not just in the words but in the structures. And I have a flash story that it's forthcoming in Khmer, that it's kind of experimental, and I hope in the future you will be able to enjoy it.
I love stories that kind of play with form and are experimental as well as, you know, doing, you know, horrifying things within the narrative, but can sometimes be enhanced with, you know, the way that they're told, which is always fun. Evgenia, did you have anything that you wanted to elaborate on or
Yeah, first of all, that was not a dog. That was my monster boyfriend.
Oh,
There we go.
Always comes back to monsters.
Second, so the type of horror that I tend to write, as I said, I like women as protagonists a lot, to read and to write. I do like body horror a lot, because it feels like the most intimate thing, like our bodies are the most intimate things. So I like to show that how our bodies reflect the world and the reality outside. So when our bodies get sort of distorted in some ways, that reflects both the theme of the story, but also the reality. It ripples out into the world. Another thing that I like a lot in horror is how nature can, how the human nature and the nature outside can have a sort of interplay and mirror each other. So these are my usual tropes.
Yeah. Those are always fun. So now that we've all sort of talked a little bit
Also
about
monsters.
always monsters about what we, you know, like to read and what we like to write, I'm wondering if any of you have sort of noticed any trends in general that have kind of been emerging in horror narratives in recent years, whether that's in short fiction or novels or movies or even video games, or if there's, you know, any sort of more classical horror themes that you think are due for a refresh or that you'd kind of like to see come back.
well, if I may, again.
Absolutely.
The Gothic haunted house is getting on trend again, I feel, and I'm very happy about that. We have had in the last few years new good additions to the genre, such as the Hill House series they made for Netflix, which is very different from the Shirley Jackson novel, but I enjoy it a lot because again it's part of the kind of stories that deals with families and having their own ghosts and everything like that. And last year we had Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which was basically the horror hype for the year and deservedly so. So yes, I am a sucker for the Haunted Manor novel being the haunting done by actual ghosts or whatever is the twist. I think we had also Riley Sager wrote a haunted house kind of thriller novel last year. I'm not sure, but anyway, I am ready for the Renaissance. You know, I'm not even sure if they will ever end. They ever went out of fashion the haunted manor because I feel like they're always lurking. Mm, whatever age we are, but I am more than ready for them to be mainstream again. And vampires. Not I know I spoke about my talked about my monster boyfriend, but I am ready for the not romantic, glittery, glamorous vampire type, but the scary vampire type. I want monsters, the werewolves, the vampires. I don't necessarily want them to be sexy. I mean, they can be sexy. I'm not going to complain about sexy monsters, but I miss stories in which the monsters are scary. You know, you don't want to have sex with them, you want to scream and run. Because there was this moment a decade ago or so, the monsters were back. They made a comeback, but they were back as the love interest only, and it makes me feel a bit like if Alien had been made back then, and the xenomorph would be obligatory sexy, pretending not to be attracted to Ripley, and then asking her on a date, you know, This is the acid-proof skin of a killer. And honestly, I would watch that movie. But sometimes you just want your monster to be a monster.
It would be interesting to see if we kind of do see that shift back to more monstrous monsters after, as you say, sort of the trend of, you know, making monsters a little bit more friendly and sexy.
Yes, we have already dated all the monsters that we could possibly date.
It's time for them to be terrifying again.
I don't know if it's a trend, if trend is the right word per se, but I'm super here for the fact that more, and honestly, in my opinion, the best horror writers are marginalized of some sort these days. Women, people of color, queer people, and it's. I think some of the sharpest and best work coming from marginalized horror writers these days is different from classic horror a la Lovecraft, bless his racist soul, in one very important way, which is that classic horror was often about the other coming in to disrupt the status quo, or like the other coming in from outside to upend the security that exists in the inn. But modern horror, like Alyssa Wong's or Priya Sharma's or Inder Pramit Das's or Stephen Graham Jones is so often about, well, we live in the horror every day. Our everyday lives are the horror, right? Like I think that was why Get Out was just the phenomenon that it was, because it especially to like white audiences who it was there for many of them. I think it was the first time like cottoning on to the fact that, oh, our everyday existences of people like me, marginalized people, we just live in the horror 24/7, right? The horror isn't coming in from the outside. The horror is the air we breathe and the water we swim in, and just existing under those circumstances and making our way through the world in our everyday lives is a constant act of horror, and in and of itself.
Absolutely. And it's actually kind of interesting to see how some of that intersects with, since you mentioned Lovecraft, I feel like that's been kind of like coming back and people reclaiming that. Like you see a lot of, you know, queer narratives and narratives by people of color and narratives by women and, you know, people who are just kind of reclaiming Lovecraft and putting their own spin on it and kind of, as you say, sort of bringing in that like, you know, everyday existence is horror and it's not, you know, us as the other coming in, but you know, we're the ones living the horror, which is really, really interesting. And I'm not sure if we lost Nellie or not. I see sort of a blank square, but hopefully she's able to come back in. But Jevnia, do you have any thoughts on trends that you're seeing or would like to see?
I cannot. Yes, I cannot see you, so I'm not. I can't get all the cues when I'm about to speak. I can only understand when you address me because I can't see anybody. So, first of all, I know that we have run out of monsters to date, but what if we make new monsters to date? You understand? Like we can create new monsters so we can date them. New monster boyfriends.
Build your own monster boyfriend. Here for it.
Second, I agree that I like that I see the reinterpretations of Lovecraftian racist legacy being reclaimed by marginalized authors. But I also think that Gothic is also being claimed by marginalized authors in the same way, like with Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I do like that, you know, Gothic doesn't necessarily mean one thing, like fog, very pale people necessarily, like, you know, it can become many things and can come from many different countries. And I don't know, maybe I will write some Greek Gothic at some point or some Greek interpretation of Lovecraft myth. So I do like that these authors are coming up and sharing their stories and their interpretations, because they're also giving me the courage or the ideas to try something new.
I love what Silvia Moreno Garcia did with Mexican Gothic, and that's a good point. That's, you know, something I would personally love to see, you know, reinterpreted by more marginalized authors and, you know, with more international settings as she did. That would be a great trend to see. And it looks like we have Nellie back, so I'll call on her next. If you can hear us, Nellie.
Nelly?
Maybe she's still reconnecting.
Probably.
You could try messaging her in the chat, maybe. She said she's having internet problems.
Okay. I guess I'll move on to my next question then, and we can always come back to that once Nellie is fully reconnected. So I think, you know, that sort of everybody's answer to the last question is a pretty good segue to the next one, which is when it comes to horror that is published outside of the United States or written for non-English audiences as the primary audience. Ooh, I can't speak today. Have you seen sort of a marked difference in the types of stories that are being told? And are there any sort of trends that you see in horror that is written outside of North America and written primarily for a non-English audience?
I mean, I am somewhat shamefully out of touch with the Indian market since I haven't lived there in 5 years, and but books and the Indian literature scene is like we don't function along some of the same genre divisions as the non-American one does. For instance, we don't quite have the same clear demarcation between realistic fiction and fantasy that the non-American market does. Like fantasy is just more commonly accepted as an inclusion in like all kinds of fiction. Like it's not necessarily this is a fantasy book; it's just a book.
Mm-hmm.
It happens to have some things that are magic, or that couldn't really happen, you know. And in the same way, I don't think we have. I mean, this may have changed recently, of course, but at least when I was growing up, there wasn't a horror tradition so much as there was a very strong one of ghost stories. Like the ghost stories, at least in my part of India and Bengal, is like a super culturally rich and significant tradition, and I love that, and I love how much of it, in retrospect, was domestic. Like a lot of intimate settings, ordinary people, very intimate horror, school teachers, wives, mothers, stuff happening in the home, in the classroom, and markets, and I love that.
That's wonderful because yeah, that is something, as you say, you don't see as much of in North American fiction and everything. It does seem to be very, you know, rigidly segmented and you know, as marketing categories and even, you know, sometimes with reader loyalty, like, oh, I wouldn't read in that genre, but I'll read in this genre, and you know, it's just interesting that, you know, it's less rigid. Clara, do you have any thoughts you want to
Well, one thing to know about Brazil is that most of what we consume when it comes to popular culture comes from the United States. So we love horror, but we actually don't write a lot of horror. I mean, the mainstream publishing market, we just don't have a very long tradition of being horror writers. So, but we are obsessed about horror when it comes from the United States. You know, we love serial killers. We love Fred Krueger. We love Jason Voorhees. We don't have nothing as iconic as that. We don't have a Brazilian Fred Krueger. We just don't have, if I may call so, a long tradition of serial killers. We don't actually have this in Brazil. I mean, when we want a white guy to murder someone, we just electing president, you know. And so, in that sense, the trend that I am finally seeing in Brazil, it's more the thriller horror kind of story. I mean, we have Rafael Montes. He had a book, one of his books published in English and other languages, called Perfect Days, Just Perfeitos. And it deals with a psychopath, much in the vein of John Fowles, The Collector. He co-authored a book with Liana Casoy, a true crime writer, called Good Morning, Veronica. Bom Dia, Veronica. I don't know if it was translated to other languages, but they made a Netflix series about it. So if you have Netflix, I'm sure you can all watch Good Morning, Veronica. And so we have this rising trend of the thriller finally becoming more mainstream. Not before that, we will only have horror in small doses in the terms of literary fiction, but now we are kind of expanding the market for genre fiction. And so we have Claudia Lemes, Paula Febres, just to name a few authors who write thrillers set in Brazil. Not to say that we don't have writers who write supernatural horror, but big publishers don't usually pay that much attention to supernatural horror here in Brazil from Brazilian authors. But we do have excellent authors writing supernatural horror, like Jana Bianchi is one of them, and she has published in Clarkesworld already, and other magazines to come. Here we have small publishers that, like Corvus, they publish a lot of indie horror writers, Alan de Sá, Alex Silva, Fabiana Ferraza. I could spend the whole day naming them, you know. But just to say that in Brazil there is this kind of what they're publishing in the indie market, which is really, really small, and which is more like speculative fiction, you know, fantasy, sci-fi, horror, supernatural horror. And the mainstream is now opening to horror, but so far mostly thrillers.
Very cool. And I'm gonna have to check out that Good Morning, Veronica. That sounds interesting. I see we have Nellie back with us. So I'll actually give her an opportunity to answer both questions at once as to whether there are any emerging trends in recent horror in general that you see, and if you see different trends in horror that's written primarily for a non-English audience or written outside of North America.
Yes, I apologize. The internet monster is it's being hard with me, but I think that this answer would be like the same for me. For the Spanish-speaking side of Latin America, there's a trend that it's happening now, that it's mixing the real life horrors, daily horrors, with supernatural horrors. And we're talking about like narco violence, femicide, gender-related violence, enforced disappearances, and all these kind of horrible things that are happening every day are being mixed with the supernatural, and it's like hard, and it's a punch in the gut, but at the same time, it's people reclaiming our spaces. Like Latin America, it's us, and you know, like politics and narcos and all that. You're not the ones that are causing fear. It's the supernatural, right? Yeah. So yeah, and also it's like a very mixed with what Nips was saying about like literary fiction and a little bit of genre are kind of mixed, and the genre adjacent are there's not like a big contrast with some genres like noir. Mexico has a very big tradition of noir, but it's more published in the literary side of things and not as genre. And also because in Mexico, one of our foundational novels, like literary novels of the 20th century, it's a ghost story. It's like the perfect novel for Mexico. It's Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, but it's a ghost story. So we have that kind of mix there. Yeah, there's genre that it's about the reality of everyday life, but there's also like this genre that it's like mixing elements of horror and literary fiction. Well, I will have to say that there's not a lot of translated horror fiction from Mexico and Latin America, but I think that we will be talking about like that something in a question. Like,
Well, hopefully we start to see more of it being translated. I
yeah.
feel like, there's a little bit more of a hunger for that now in North America to get more translated fiction. Or at least I hope there is. I mean, I know I'd like to see more, and I feel like other people, would like to as well. But Evgenia, do you have any thoughts on trends in international horror?
I mean, if we are talking about Greece, I think that Greece is a weird example because generally we don't have a big market for the speculative genre. We don't like usually in the bookstores you will see fantasy and science fiction or horror maybe being marketed as young adult, like put in the young adult section, which is a bit weird. But we do have a lot of weird horror and slipstream or fabulous tradition because we do have those folk stories and even folk songs that are quite they have quite a bit of horror in them. I think that we are starting now having some writers that write supernatural horror, but it's also mixed with noir, as I think Clara and Nelly said. They're a bit mixed between thriller and supernatural horror. But one that I would say stands out is Papamarcos, which probably is not translated. He writes short stories and I think some comics as well. And he's doing a homage to folk stories and Greek folk horror, and that is upon a subject that's very sensitive in Greece, and that is wars. The wars that Greece has been into. It has a very long history, but also civil war. And he uses horror as a metaphor to show all the aspects of what war can do to a family or to a country. And I think it lingers a lot with the Greek conscience because especially the civil war is something that it's a very very sensitive subject in Greece, and it happened around 60, 70 years ago, and it's still a very sore subject. So I think that his collections are very interesting, and they balance between the weird, the horror, and the fabulism. And this is mostly what Greek horror feels like.
Interesting. That's another one that I'll have to hope somebody translates at some point.
Same.
So this is sort of going to be a bit of a similar question, I guess, or at least another aspect of the question. As writers, I mean, at least two of you are currently living outside of the US, and the other two have lived outside of the US. Do you find yourselves approaching storytelling differently when you're aiming to publish in North America versus publishing elsewhere? And have you ever found yourself reluctant to write or publish a piece based on how you perceive it fitting or not fitting with certain North American conventions and expectations? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in, or again, I can call on people. I don't know, Nelly, you look like you were about to say something.
It's a very hard subject. Recently, Twitter, like the whole community, were having a conversation about something related. It started with Vida Cruz talking about this kind of relance from editor publishers to publish stories with past protagonists, right? And many people were saying that, well, these protagonists are very normal in American narratives or non-American narratives. So, well, sometimes it's hard when you're trying to write something that is on that narrative, and you're thinking about this editor by should I write like more to appealing to a white American audience? That's a question that I have like all the time, right? And also, and again, in Spanish-speaking Latin America, we have this tradition of being very fragmentary, and it's not something that it's very commercial in America, like being that kind of fragmentary. It's more of on the literary side of things, right? It's like too literary, but too genre. So we're in this liminal space. So it's hard to think about if catering to the white American eye or writing what it comes from your heart if you want to sell those stories.
Yeah, definitely that would be
Yeah.
hard. Clara, I think I saw your hand up, maybe.
My fingers. Well, I have been lucky in that what I get to write is what I get to publish. I don't usually have to adapt my stories to a North American audience. And what I write in English is basically what I would write in Portuguese. And of course, I count myself as lucky in that all the magazines and editors that have published me so far, they have been very open to non-North American voices. They want our stories, they want our voices, our particular prose. So I think it's nice that I mean, I understand it's not everyone's experience when publishing the international market, which is mostly the North American market. But by the day, I have been seeing these new magazines emerging. Magazines that have in its core the idea of publishing fiction in different languages or translating fiction that otherwise the bigger audiences would never get to read. And there is Constellation, there is Eita magazine, which is a Brazilian magazine, and well, just a few examples, but I have noticed that a lot more are emerging by the day. And that makes me happy that there is a place for there is there are readers that are interested in knowing fiction that is not necessarily adapted to the taste of the North American audience.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely nice to see, like as you say, more publications that are, either doing one-off issues that are focusing on translated fiction or have as their core.
Yes, Strange
translated
Horizons does
fiction.
that too. They did a Brazilian special version edition issue, and a Palestinian one, if I recall correctly,
and a Mexican one last year.
A Mexican one. So it's nice, and even in bigger magazines, there are not doing special issues. I see that more and more they are welcoming, at least asking for writers outside of North America to submit more often. So that's really nice. It's the changing that it's coming.
It's definitely good
I
to
do feel
see.
like a lot of this trailblazing is happening in short fiction, like because it's more open to trying different things and being
Yes.
innovative before the larger trade fiction novel industry, which is a whole different beast, ever if ever gets there. But I feel like we're living in a golden age of short fiction. I keep saying this because it's true. It's just the stuff coming out. It's just, oh my god, it's so good. There's so much of it.
Absolutely. And I think, the rise of online publishing has helped that a lot in terms of, being accessible to a wider audience and maybe, more publications willing to take more of a risk and able to react, to get things online faster rather than the sort of slower cycle of physical publishing.
Yes, the fact that we can submit online now, it really made our lives much more easier.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than, people living outside of the US having to, pay all the international postage to send something off and, it might not feel as worth it as just, I can send an email. So that in itself has opened up things a lot.
Yeah.
Evgenia, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
I feel that, at least for me, it has changed a bit since I started in English, because I feel like short stories in English have to have a hook in the beginning. Well, I don't necessarily do that. Well, I didn't used to do that when I was writing in Greek. You have to sort of grab the audience from the beginning with something interesting in order to, keep them engaged. If there is something different that I feel happens is that I'm not sure how they would react to a very modern Greek setting, like, a city setting. Also, I usually write something more vague, something more folk horrors, and usually the foreign market knows mythology, Greek mythology a lot, and there are a lot of Greek mythology related books, not and some short fiction going around. But so that also makes it more difficult for me to write Greek mythology because it feels like the market might be saturated by it. So it is a balance. Like as a Greek author, you have to find the balance between writing something everybody's writing about and writing something that people are completely unfamiliar with, like Athens right now. So my balance is mostly folk horror, but that's what for me is has changed. Like I have to think what I will write about when I write in English. Like if it has been done at least 10 times this year or not in some stories. Not everything, but if it's mostly Greek related fiction.
And it's worse too because like Western centric, North American centered publishing is there can be only one. We already published a Greek short story this year. That's it. We gotta have another one, right?
No, it can be Greek. It's just
we could have 50 stories of white people in a year, but like 2 Greek stories in the same issue. That's just weird.
Because of course, all Greek stories
you can
must be
have
exactly the same.
Oh
you
my
can
god,
have more than
that's my fear. Being the Brazilian author. No, you have already a Brazilian author writing horror. Why do you want another one?
Who could possibly want more than one voice? It's just ridiculous.
that is also a fear. That is also a fear. Yeah, but the fact that there are magazines that publish, translations back and forth, or there are magazines now that feel they're more internationally focused. I think that helps a lot with international people's confidence, international writers' confidence to submit and to read as well stories that reflect them more.
So unfortunately, I think we're actually bumping up against our time. But I'll go around
No.
really quickly. I mean, I know we have to clear out for the next panel that's coming in, but maybe just really quickly we could go around if anybody has closing thoughts. Eugenia, do you want
Have
to
some
start us
closing
off?
thoughts.
Yeah, or clothing thoughts. I mean, either way.
I feel like this shirt really brings out my hair color. Anyway,
It does.
closing thoughts. There was a question here that we don't have time to talk about, and it's about maybe what kind of horror we would like to see more of. I think that for me, internationally, very quickly, I would like to see historical horror. Like, for example, there are a lot of moments in Greece's history that people don't know about, and history sounds a bit boring, but there are a lot of moments in international history that the US audience doesn't know about. And I feel that if they are written, it doesn't matter if it's horror or science fiction or fantasy, by international authors, that will bring more awareness to international history, the countries that are around, and moments that people have ever thought about, like the Greek Civil War or the German occupation or the time that Greece was under Ottoman occupation, like things like that. Okay, I'm talking not about Greece. I'm Greek. For you to bring up like in different countries by colonialism or generally speaking. That's it.
Yeah, it'd be great to see more of that. Nibs, super quick closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I always want more stories by marginalized writers. I want more stories that recognize colonialism for the devouring, cannibalistic force that it was. This is a very specific ask. I want to see more stories about internet horror because, I grew up on the internet. Like when I think about the backdrop of my growing up, I think the internet as much as I think India. And there's a very specific culture of creepypasta and urban legends and forums and Slenderman and a new generation of myths and monsters being born in real time, mimetically. That is just so fascinating to me, and so I just want to see more of it.
That'd be great. Nelly, quick closing thoughts.
I would like to see more translated fiction, horror fiction to English. Like it doesn't matter what kind of horror, but bring more international writers into English. And well, maybe horror mixed with climate fiction.
Yeah,
we have Hope Punk, but I would also love to see like the horror side of it. So.
Absolutely. And Clara, quick closing thoughts.
Like I said before, I want more haunted houses from around the globe, and your monsters. Give me your monsters, the monsters that belong to your myths and legends. From the place you grew up, I want to be scared by them, and I want to date them.
Well, thank you all so much for being such wonderful panelists. Thank you to everybody who listened into the panel. And we can all jump over to Discord if people want to keep the conversation going. And yeah, again, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you for being an amazing moderator and for inviting me to this.
It was a pleasure, everyone.
Absolutely.
This was the best first panel. I'm pretty sure of it.
It's good shit.
Really, really wonderful.